Welcome to When Technology Goes Wrong. In every episode, we take a deep dive into a technology failure, figure out what happened, and the big lessons learned. I'm your host, Paddy and I head up the product discovery and agile practices here at QA. Today, we're going to talk about the 2020 A-level algorithmic marking fiasco. I'm joined today by Tom Chatfield. He's one of the UK's top philosophers of technology. He's the author of several books about tech, and including his recently released Wise Animals, which is about humanity's long relationship with technology, from the pickaxe to modern smartphones. Hi, Tom. Welcome to the show.
Hello. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, Tom, I'm going to just do a quick summary of this story, and then we're going to deep dive a few questions that I've got that I'm really curious to ask you about. So if we cast our minds back to summer 2020, coronavirus has forced the country into lockdown, but there are thousands and thousands of students nervously waiting, as they do every year. They're waiting for those A-level and GCSE results. The only problem was that they hadn't actually sat any exams. They weren't allowed to because there were strict social distancing rules that the government had imposed. So the Department of Education created an emergency new marking system. They designed an algorithm to determine students' A-level and GCSE results. Teachers were asked to give an estimated grade to each student and then ranked against every other pupil at school who was predicted the same grade. The algorithm took that information, performed some fancy voodoo, and also factored in school performance over the previous 3 years. From that, the algorithms then spat out a grade for each student. Rather than just getting teachers to give grades, the idea was to use technology to make it more objective. Or so they thought. The department was worried that teachers would be overly generous. But what happened? When the grades were announced in August 2020, they were much harsher than teachers' estimated grades, around 40% lower, especially in state schools. As a result, there was a massive outcry from students and parents that it was unfair and biased. Bright students from poor performing schools were especially punished. The Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, shortly ditched the system and reverted to teacher assessments instead. A little while later, Boris Johnson, I'm sure we remember him, he told a room full of school children, "I'm afraid your grades were almost derailed by a mutant algorithm." Well, Tom, what a fascinating story. And I know you've been looking into this. So could you fill in some of the gaps so that we can get some of the other important details of the story?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting story. And the first thing that interests me is that it's a rare example of a really, really public fallout over a kind of algorithmic result. So a lot of the time, we talk about bias in algorithms, we talk about problems with data and fairness. And often we're reaching for relatively obscure stories or stories that affect people in a minority, but that don't hit the national news. And here we have the government in a week performing a U-turn very publicly on a kind of massive algorithmic approach. And to some degree, the first thing that interests me about this story is just that it shows what happens when some perceived unfairness baked into an algorithmic decision collides with public opinion and, of course, with the middle classes and the majority of a population rather than perhaps a minority who are discriminated against on a regular basis in various ways. The second thing that really interests me is that Ofqual, who set this up for the government, were very thoughtful about trying to be fair. They wanted to avoid grade inflation. They wanted to try and have fairness in terms of the pandemic results accurately reflecting past patterns and not being outliers. And so they decided to have an algorithm that balanced teachers' predictions, which always do tend to be overgenerous, with performance over the last 3 years and some elements of weighting towards individual performance. And interestingly, having teachers' predictions be, around 40% out is not atypical. That is not a wild outlier. But unfortunately for the government, people reacted very, very strongly against the basic idea that they were being judged by an algorithm, that they weren't, so to speak, having their day in court. And this is a really important lesson, that fairness is not just about a statistically fair result that says this is in line broadly with past patterns. Fairness is also a perception that in a way that your story's been heard by fellow humans, that you've had your chance. That classic thing we all say in call centres, I want to talk to a person, I want to talk to a human, I want to have my chance. And the first point for me then is that it defied this very intensely felt sense of fairness, that I want to have my chance to be judged by fellow humans. And I don't want to have a vision of fairness imposed upon me that really says, okay, the last 3 years of performance in this school, the kind of statistically likely output that a person at this school in this subject gets is my fate. I don't want my exam grades to feel like my car insurance quote based on my postcode, because what this meant crucially is that if you are an absolutely exceptional student at a low performing school, under this system, it is almost impossible for the algorithm to give you an A, because if nobody has got that for the last 3 years in this subject, the algorithm is very, very heavily going to kind of anchor your performance to the statistically likely outputs of that school. So again, there's this complex sense of fairness in which the chance to prove you are truly exceptional is something we deem very precious and greatly dislike it when we perceive that's being taken away from us or from others.
Yeah, I was trying to draw a comparison of something that I've faced, which was not a similar situation, but it reminded me of when we sold our house, for example, and the valuation came back much lower than what I thought. And when I delved into that, they said, well, it's based on however much other houses on the street had been sold for previously. But actually every house in that street was completely unique. And so they had failed to factor in the uniqueness of the property and the value of that property. But obviously we're talking about real lives here and children's lives. And, we've seen just how stressful it can be to study for these exams. And then to have this done to you is there's no words for it, really. I can't think of anything worse as a parent. And with your sort of expertise in technology, what did you think when you first heard about this?
Well, one of the things I thought was that here are some people falling into a really common category error. So they've come up with, a quite good algorithmic system that is in many ways, on paper, when you model it, demonstrably fair in that it's going to produce a distribution that mirrors previous years and that makes allowances for individual performance. And it doesn't just let teachers big up their students regardless of the baseline. So that's fine. That's a good start. But it's a good start. It's not a solution. And what's then happened is that rather than anticipating how people might react to this, and rather than embedding this algorithmic approach in a process of appeal or consultation or critical reflection, it's simply been kind of launched as your algorithmic solution. We've solved this problem. We've done a good job. And of course, it's a pandemic. They're under a lot of pressure. But the really fundamental point is that fairness is not a product of algorithms on their own as magical boxes that make our problems go away. Fairness is a sort of complex property of a system, and that requires a degree of accountability and transparency, but also mechanisms for appeal, mechanisms for consultation, mechanisms for critical reflection. And so if I imagine the process that's going on here, it's obviously imagination on my part, but I think it's privileging the algorithmic in a narrow sense and really down-rating the value of the consultative and of the domain-specific knowledge. Because if you talk to teachers and students and parents, you're going to find out pretty quickly that they really do not like the idea of being judged by a computer. Computer says yes, computer says no, without there being explanation or recourse. And maybe that they react really strongly against the idea that it's ironing out the exceptional. And of course, there's other subtle problems in there, such as the fact that from a statistically sensible perspective, they put less weight on the algorithm's results with very small class sizes, with small cohorts, because the data is less reliable. So when you had a small cohort, you put more weight on teachers' predictions. And with a kind of ultra small class, you really put full weight on teachers' predictions. Unfortunately, if you think about that for a moment in the context of the school system, where do we find smaller cohorts? More privileged schools. We're more likely to find them among sixth formers doing Latin at a private school than we are among people at a comprehensive studying maths. And so we have a very unfortunate advantage because we know that teachers tend to be overly generous. And then within a week, the government abolishes this. It goes with teachers' predictions. And suddenly we're uprating everyone's grades. And now that year's results are the very thing they wanted to avoid, a huge outlier. And universities have problems. More people are making their offers than there are places for. And universities, some of them, I think, end up paying students potentially or incentivizing them to defer their places. So the problem, in other words, is not that they fail to come up with the perfect magic algorithm. It's that they failed, I think, to understand the degree to which coming up with an algorithm is just step 0.5. And if you're going to sell it as a fair solution, and if you're going to make it part of a fair system, you really need to consider domain knowledge, its embedding, its accountability, its explainability, appeal. You need to consider the mechanisms that make it a functional part of a system, rather than just a isolated exercise in theoretically how might we do something optimal on paper here.
Tom, I'm just thinking about the team that would have put this together. I mean, do you have any insight into how they went about that? Like in terms of, you mentioned they're actually going to speak to real parents and children, doing that kind of product discovery work, something that I'm really passionate about when we're building products, is really understanding your users, your sort of consumers of your services. How would they have gone about that?
Yeah, so because I don't know exactly what they did, I don't want to sort of say they did or didn't do this definitively. But I've dealt with a lot of cases like this. Some while ago, I edited and worked on a report into digital government. And one thing that always stuck with me is that when government digital services were first being established, maybe 15 years ago now, the UK was a world leader, and there was a kind of code of practice or kind of principles for design. And number one on that list was begin with needs. You start with needs. This is a common idea in product design. It's not a common idea in digital government, because often what you tend to start with is, if you like, the political objective. Rather than the needs of the end users, of the citizens, you start with the needs of the system. And I strongly suspect that what happens here, for good reasons, this is a pandemic. People are under incredible pressure. They're trying to solve an unprecedented problem. No one can sit an exam. This is incredible, right? Who would have thought you'd be in a situation where literally nobody could physically sit an exam? So you have to come up with literally a substitute for exams. But then you started with the problem, I think, rather than the needs. And if you start with the needs, and then you map those, and then you try to, in a way, solve the problem as simply as you can, which often doesn't mean technology. And so rather than saying we're designing an algorithm, we're designing a technical solution, you're not. You're designing a system, one component of which is an algorithm, but other components of which are exactly what you say, this consultative process, this critical reflection, this explicability, this mechanism for appeal, this mechanism for redress. The thing that I think didn't get said is that we are going to have a lot of people who are going to be, we suspect, very unhappy with this, have a lot of questions. So we're going to have to put a lot of resource into anticipating and answering and addressing those questions. Now, hopefully, lessons have been learned here, but unfortunately, I think for everything good that's done in public sector digital, there tends to be something, if you like, solutionist, where people are trying to impose a solution. And the great problem we have with that is that if you're starting with the solution you want to impose rather than the needs, you end up almost by default embedding various kinds of bias and exclusion in the system. And in this case, unfortunately, the algorithm was prone to entrenching certain pre-existing inequalities. And of course, again, I don't think at this stage you're involving that many data scientists and sociologists and experts who know a lot about algorithmic bias, because there's a red flag there saying the past is the map we want to follow, we want the future to look like the past, is very dangerous if you have good reason to believe that these past patterns are problematic or exclusionary in some ways. To quote just one expert on this, Kathy O'Neill, a well-known American expert on algorithms, was giving evidence to the Senate a couple of years ago. And she talked about the need for a cockpit as a metaphor when you're dealing with these systems. And the reason she said a cockpit is that it's about empowered human agency. You want to have a full view of the instruments. You want to see what an algorithm is doing, not in raw terms, which are hard to process, but like a pilot. You want to have actionable data about where it's going and why and where it's headed. And you want to be able to intervene. You want to be able to fly that plane. The algorithm, the policy, it's a plane you're trying to land. It's not a plane you're building on the ground. It's a plane you're trying to bring into land. You need to know what's going on. You need to make adjustments. You need to have kind of meaningful, actionable oversight. And that for me is a golden principle. Humans in the loop, yes, but where and how and which loops? How do you build loops that are empowering of experts, of users, with the contextual knowledge required to make sense of this intervention or product in human terms?
I love that analogy just there with the cockpit. I think that really does sort of bring it to life in the way that you mentioned there. And what does this story really tell us about the relationship between humans and machines? You know, in your book, it's a story that's been unfolding for thousands of years.
Yeah. So one line I like to quote on this is from the director of the MIT System Dynamics Group, a great author called John D. Sterman. And he wrote, interestingly, in a 2011 paper about medical crises in the context of public health, well predating the pandemic. And he said, when we're looking at any complex system, there are no side effects. There are just effects. Those effects that we expected or that proved beneficial, we call the main effects and we claim credit for them. And those that undercut our policies and cause harm, we claim to be side effects. But side effects are not a feature of reality. They're a sign that the boundaries of our mental models are too narrow, our time horizons too short. And this kind of systems thinking is incredibly important, I think, because when we create a technological intervention, we're building a system. We're not coming up with an answer. We're coming up with something dynamic and interactive and complex, especially if we're using AI, especially if we're drawing on huge data sets. And it's very easy to say, well, the effects, these are the good things, right? This has lifted people out of poverty. This has given citizens actionable information. This has churned out grades that are demonstrably fair. Well done us. Unfortunately, there were some side effects. And those side effects are that people from less privileged backgrounds have been disproportionately disadvantaged by this, or that people without computers or stable broadband connections or digital skills can't take advantage of this wonderful new service. But that's not our fault. It's an unfortunate side effect that sharp-elbowed members of the middle class are reaping these advantages and leveraging their status. It's a very tempting thing to say. But these are all just effects, and you have to own those effects. In my book, I talk about this idea of what I call virtuous cycles of technological development. which is maybe a bit of a kind of fancy philosophical phrase. But for me, it's about this idea that actually, as you pointed out, we have always been creating technologies. We have always been, as a species, instantiating our values, our ethics, our education, our defense, our lives in technological artifacts. Houses, clothes, roads, weapons, writing. The human-made world is a compendium of technologies and innovations, and all of them have complex effects. And all of those effects, we can't anticipate them, but we can debate and deliberate upon them. Car accidents are a side effect of cars, or rather, they're an effect. The philosopher Paul Virilio very nicely says to invent the train is to invent the train wreck. To invent the car is to invent the car crash. And so a virtuous circle of development involves owning consequences, reflecting upon them and trying to mitigate and debate and improve upon them. It's incremental and it's imperfect, but it's an incredibly important mindset for understanding that the systems we make are not just stuff. They're part of the texture of our lives, of our cities. Self-driving cars are a classic example of this. Great good can come from making driving safer. Automobile accidents are a huge global killer, and they're not a necessary or inevitable killer. Unlike old age, the number of people who die in any given city from an automobile accident could theoretically be reduced to zero or close to it. But when we are creating driver safety systems, self-driving cars and so on, we then need to be incredibly careful to think about what we're doing as part of the fabric of urban space. When I go to San Francisco, I enjoy getting in a self-driving car. I enjoy watching them beetling around the streets like little insects. But I'm also conscious that the emergent behaviors that these very expensive objects have involve them kind of clustering in certain areas, involve them potentially creating hazards to emergency vehicles wanting to get to places, reacting to pedestrians in unexpected ways, and so on. It doesn't mean they're inherently dangerous. There's many things to recommend about them, but it does mean that developing and deploying them safely and wisely means being very attentive indeed to these consequences, these cascading chains of cause and effect. So that for me is the lesson, that difficult as it is, we try to get rid of this word, this phrase, side effects, and to pay close attention to that which is under our noses, and to ask for each product, each intervention, what a virtuous circle of deployment, reflection, analysis, and critical iteration looks like.
I'm going to play devil's advocate now, Tom. I mean, are we just giving machines a hard time here? Because I've seen studies where judges sometimes perform irrationally. For example, there was a study that I came across whereby during the period just before lunchtime, judges were more likely to convict people because of their desire for food and their desire to get things wrapped up.
Yeah, that's the famous Israeli judge ego depletion study. Yes, absolutely. No, you're quite right. And in a way, I'm sorry to cut across you there. I was getting excited. Did you have a point to finish before I get carried away? It's a much cited study. It's hard to replicate, but it touches on something very important. So we shouldn't be giving machines a hard time when they don't deserve it. And we should be giving humans a hard time when they do deserve it. But of course, for me, the observation I'm making is that treating either humans or technological and social systems in isolation is missing the point. One reason we have sentencing guidelines is that sentencing guidelines are a proven automation. They're an algorithmic, if you like. They don't have to be in a machine, for redressing the fact that human judgments can be very unfair, very noisy, if you like. Noise meaning variance that is not due to any particular important or conditioning factor. Noise, as opposed to bias, exists when we simply have a large amount of variance for no good dominant reason whatsoever. And it is bad. Sentencing guidelines are great because we do not want the judges in this state being harsh towards pickpockets when the judges in the state next door, for a whole bunch of reasons that have no bearing on justice, are lenient. We certainly don't want judges to be more likely to parole people immediately after a meal than before it. It's a really interesting experiment because it's much cited and discussed, and it also has a lot of potentially confounding factors, such as, well, but when do they schedule the difficult cases? Are there hidden properties of the data? But for me, I think you're absolutely right that anything that says, oh, well, either, people are stupid and fallible and we should replace them with machines, or machines are bad and inhuman and we should get rid of them, that misses the point. The point is to honestly scrutinize data and processes and systems, and to some degree realize that every justice system, every technological system is a combination of humans and human-made automated or semi-automated elements. So if we want to have fairer sentencing, we need to look at the data. We need to try to identify where there are noise, where there is injustice. But we also need to look, for example, at the fact, as the scholar of AI and law, John Tasoulis, puts it, he's the head of the AI Ethics Institute in Oxford, we must also remember that a machine cannot stand in solidarity with other humans. It cannot be held accountable. I may wish to be tried by a jury of 10 or 12 fallible humans with all their biases, so that I have made my case to humans. In American experiments, we sometimes see that people prefer to have the chance to tell their story to a human judge, even if they believe they will be judged more harshly than by algorithm, because, to go back to a phrase I used earlier, they want to have their day in court. Ultimately, of course, it's ridiculous to blame machines, because even in an age of super powerful AI, no large language model wakes up and says, today I'm going to make a bunch of people redundant and I'm going to hurt some children. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say anything. It doesn't want anything. It doesn't know anything. It doesn't desire anything in a human sense. The buck stops with its makers and maintainers. It's a very complex buck, but these are the people we need to hold accountable. I know what a corporation wants. It wants to make money, and that's fine. But obviously I want it to make money in a way that doesn't do gross damage to my bodily, mental, intellectual rights and so on. I'm an author. My books are being busily ripped off by various AIs for profit. I don't want that. It doesn't mean that I think AIs want to rob me, and it doesn't mean that I think AI is bad or stupid. It means that I think the legislation and incentives and transparency and accountability around the training of AI models needs to be held to a high standard in order to earn and deserve trust. So I love that you've highlighted that. And in some ways, the great prize or promise for me is that if we look at the evidence with an open mind, we can build systems that help us be better, realize our potential, overcome bias. This is what the scientific method is when it works. It's a series of systems and protocols that help us find out robust truths or insights about our universe, that help us collate data, that help us see things from more than just a distorted individual perspective. And in many ways, when it comes to technology, I feel there can be a great good in adopting a scientific mindset, in the sense of putting ideas to a meaningful test, and when the facts change, being prepared to change your mind.
You mentioned the word accountability, and I think that's such an important word, especially in this situation, but equally in this world of AI that you mentioned as well. And, Boris Johnson, he said this was a result of a mutant algorithm, again, sort of pushing that blame over to technology. And it just felt like it was a convenient way for him to remove himself from all accountability here. So how do we ensure that we build accountability into the tech products of the future?
I mean, one way we do it is by demystifying them, is by being upfront about how they work and who made the decisions. A mutant algorithm has done it. Well, okay, but why? How? Why was it allowed? If Boris Johnson stood up and says, oh, well, I'm very sorry, but a mutant disease has started to damage you because of human negligence, we would have a lot to say about that negligence. Not going to comment on the pandemic in particular, but fairly obviously, buck passing onto an algorithm is a very interesting sleight of hand, because actually the algorithm may have unintended consequences, but it never just woke up deciding to be evil. I think one very important analogy here is if we look at systems where people are in effect being governed or managed by algorithm, the kind of Uberification of different kinds of work, the casualization of labor. Cory Doctorow, the author and activist, recently talked about the kind of Uberization of some nursing work in the United States. And very briefly there, he talked about the disintermediation of this work, whereby rather than having a direct contract of employment with all the rights and responsibilities that confers, a number of nurses are being hired effectively as shift workers via an Uber-style app. But that app is able to track publicly available data or publicly purchasable data about the individual finances of these nurses. And it's able to come up with an index of how financially in distress they are in terms of their loans, in terms of their credit cards. And then it's able to differentially offer them pay depending on how desperate they are. Now, this fairly clearly is an unfair harm. The legal scholar Vina Dubal calls it algorithmic wage discrimination. It's verging on a form of wage theft, but it's done via an app, and it's done through an algorithmic process that just seems to be, it's just there, right? It's just the computer. Computer says no, computer says yes. We're used to dynamic flights. We're used to this idea that the algorithm just spits out a number for our insurance. But crucially, this happens because it's allowed to happen, because legislation and scrutiny and debate allow it to happen, and because often there can be a form of complacency coupled to opacity. So what I'm saying is, the crucial question is, well, what are we going to let people, corporations, governments, individuals get away with under the cover of algorithms, under the cover of technology? And once we have established the principles of what we believe to be fair, what we believe is owed to people and so on, the buck stops with people, the buck stops with corporations. And unfortunately, from a certain angle, it can seem that it's the authoritarian regimes of the world that know this. People say, oh, technology, it's inevitable. This is what's going to happen, right? Technology brings change. I'm old enough to remember when social media was inevitably going to bring freedom to the Middle East or to other parts of the world. That didn't happen. It turned out to be an incredibly powerful tool for surveillance, for suppressing dissent. It turns out that actually, if you're prepared to lock up tech bosses and kick people's doors down and so on, technology doesn't want you to be free at all. Technology will do what the people with the power tell it to do. But we can learn from this. We can try and build systems that embody democratic values. Those are the values we want, values of fairness, values of inclusion, values of non-discrimination. And crucially, I think, it's about where we do not want certain kinds of discrimination, certain kinds of algorithmic inspection and surveillance to go. The EU AI Act, for all the kind of flaws and complexities of it, I think is very strong in this regard, in terms of saying discriminating against people in terms of, for example, kind of biometric and behavioral prediction, in terms of stuff that's long been outlawed in the insurance industry, these kind of micro discriminations that might deny you access to a service or make your life very expensive or so on. This is not the way that we establish equality, equity, fairness in a society. So in other words, it comes back to these very human questions, and then the very interesting technical question about what it means for the effects of the systems we use to be comprehended, measured, and those in charge of them held to account.
And Tom, as a professional who works in the field of agility and agile, I often find that there's a lot of unlearning that needs to be done for individuals when they come into the world of work. And as a parent, I'm constantly almost shouting, why are my kids having to learn this way or that way? And in Wise Animals, you write more generally about technology and education. And you ask, what kind of a person are students being encouraged to grow into by an education system that assumes constant automated monitoring is a necessary feature of the world? What's the effect of taking this approach?
Yeah, so I think it's very deleterious to people's development, to people's flourishing. Among others, Carissa Veliz, the philosopher, has written a lovely book called Privacy is Power, which is really about the righteous anger we should have when various kinds of privacy are taken from us by systems that monitor us in our homes, in our workplaces, at our desks. And the reason that privacy is power is that the freedom to find our own way, to make mistakes, the freedom to decide how we wish to pursue a particular goal, how we wish to grow, the freedom to express ourselves openly, to discover who we are, to some degree, the freedom to be wrong, to be confused, and so on. When this is taken away from us, then potentially we become like miniature machines being manipulated by someone else's algorithm. And of course, at the moment, one may say, if you're innocent, you have nothing to fear. But I think current political developments in America and elsewhere give the lie to that. That once data is collected and collated, once privacy is breached, once a government has a back door into your messages and can see what you're doing, then they or an agency or a future government or a foreign power or a hacker or whoever may use that against you. May say you're not welcome in this country, you're not welcome in this school, you can't be studying that, you can't be thinking that, you can't be saying that, you can't be living that truth, you can't be forming that relationship, and so on. I think privacy is a very fundamental value because a lot of other freedoms are predicated upon it. And this is why I put the question in the form that you very nicely set out. What kind of citizens, what kind of person does this system want us to grow into? What does it expect of us? It's drawing there, among other works, by the work of the philosopher Evan Selinger and the legal scholar Brett Fisher, who wrote about what they call techno-social engineering, a very fancy phrase, but what it really means is the effect that the assumptions baked into different technologies have on us as we grow and learn. And I think a lot of unlearning is required. When I talk about AI with companies, these agile methodologies, everyone is saying, look, it's a time of profound change and disruption. It's a time when we don't know what we will need to be doing in 2, 3, 4 years' time, or what the machines that we're using will do. Because of this, we need to be adept at learning together. We need to be flexible and open-minded. We need to be very good at introspecting and at capturing what the human needs, the human experiences, the human desires are, that are, after all, the entire point of everything we're doing. We need to try and understand what the skills that we have as critical, creative, emotive, ethical thinkers are, and how they are complementary to what machines are doing. And we need not to be set in our ways. We need not to, in a sense, turn ourselves into rigid, unlearning, inflexible cogs in a machine so that we can be discarded and disregarded and thrown away. The skill to unlearn, to revise your assumptions, to adapt, to know yourself, to know others, these are more and more important educationally, ethically, and frankly in terms of the robustness of corporations. If what you do is just a slightly more efficient version of what you always did, really you're setting yourself up for disruption. You're setting yourself up for replacement by a small team of people plus a bit of AI. People need to be very inventive and curious about how they can add value, about how they can go deeper, about how they can leverage their contextual knowledge and expertise more inventively, about how they can differentiate. The way I would put it is that in an algorithmic age, with powerful AIs surrounding us, almost any question you care to ask can now be answered instantly and plausibly. But what that means is you need to pay all the more attention to asking the right questions, to determining which questions and frames of reference are worth exploring in the first place.
Tom, the time's flown by. I can't believe how quick this episode has gone. But I do have one last question for you. With machines taking over more and more functions in modern day life, what are some of the key lessons that organizations can learn from this particular story that we've delved into today?
So for me, the key lesson for organizations is that when you are creating a technology, a tool, software, a product, it is going to exist in a larger context. And to some degree, your understanding of that context and your ability to iterate and reflect in the light of it is going to make or break your offering. If you can describe something, people can spin it up very quickly, especially in the realm of software. But the domain expertise you and your people have, your curiosity, your relationships with your customers, with your clients, with your stakeholders, people can't replicate these, but it's up to you to leverage them, to use them, to explore them, to deepen them. And to make them shallower, to think that you're going to automate and self-serve everything is very dangerous indeed. And the thing I'd add to this is that I've said that the phrase, that being the human in the loop is incredibly important. But that's a beginning. Which loops, where, how, and when? There are some things you do want to automate so that you can invest time and expertise and learning elsewhere. But if the place a human is in the loop is at the end, just selecting an item off a menu designed by AI or algorithm, that human is adding very little value and is very much locked into the past data sets that the AI is trained upon or drawing upon. You want to be involved in designing the menu. You want to be involved in posing the questions, coming up with the theories, thinking like a scientist. Which ideas are worth investigating and why? It's very easy to move extremely rapidly in a misguided direction. It's very easy to dress up a bad idea as something beautiful or superficially convincing. So have the courage to go deep, to be genuinely scientific in your thinking, and to try and iterate in the light of the unique contextual knowledge and relationships that you have and that others don't.
Oh, well, thank you, Tom. That was so insightful. I definitely feel a lot wiser than I did at the start of this conversation. There's just so much there that we could probably have 10 other episodes on this topic, but really want to thank you for joining us today and sharing those insights.
That's my great pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome.